Because what I'm about to show you could completely change the way you look at the next 9 days. Welcome back to XRP Matrix. Right now, a wave of fear is spreading across the XRP community. Everywhere you look, people are talking about the July 4th deadline. Social media is flooded with countdown posts. YouTubers are calling it the most important date in crypto history. Some investors are acting as if XRP's future hangs on a single moment. And the closer we get to that deadline, the louder the panic becomes. But here's the shocking truth. The people who understand this process best aren't panicking at all. In fact, many of the individuals working closest to the legislation quietly admit that the July 4th target may be difficult to hit. Yet they still believe regulatory clarity is coming. They still believe the bill moves forward. And they still believe crypto's future remains intact. So why is everyone else losing their minds? That's exactly what we're uncovering today. Welcome back to XRP Matrix, your home for smart XRP analysis, breaking crypto news, and calm facts when everyone else is selling fear. Today we're exposing why the July 4th panic may be completely wrong and what these final 9 working days actually mean for XRP holders. Let's start with the number that's driving all the fear. 9. That's roughly how many Senate working days remain before lawmakers leave for the July 4th recess. When people hear that number, they immediately assume disaster. They think if lawmakers don't finish everything before Independence Day, the entire crypto effort collapses. They think XRP loses its opportunity. They think years of progress disappear overnight. But that assumption ignores how legislation actually works. Deadlines create pressure. They create headlines. They create drama. But they do not always determine outcomes. And that's the first thing investors need to understand before letting emotions take over. The truth is that the July 4th target was always ambitious. It was symbolic. It was powerful. It represented the idea of financial freedom and regulatory clarity arriving on America's Independence Day. From a political messaging standpoint, it made perfect sense. But symbolism and reality are two different things. Once lawmakers began working through the actual details of the legislation, it became obvious that significant challenges remained, not because crypto was losing support, not because lawmakers suddenly turned against digital assets, but because major legislation is complicated. And complicated legislation takes time. Now here's where things get really interesting. Most people screaming about the deadline never explain what actually has to happen before the bill becomes law. So let's break it down in simple terms. First, the Senate has to debate the bill. Then lawmakers must navigate procedural hurdles. Then they need enough support to move the legislation forward. After that, any differences between House and Senate versions must be resolved. Then both chambers must agree on the same final text. Only after all of that can the legislation reach the president's desk for signature. That's an enormous amount of work, even under perfect conditions. And Washington rarely operates under perfect conditions. This is exactly why some supporters privately admit that the timeline is extremely tight. But here's the part panic merchants never mention. A delay is not a defeat. Read that again. A delay is not a defeat. If lawmakers need additional time to negotiate details, that doesn't mean the legislation dies. It means the process continues. And that distinction changes everything. Because many XRP holders are reacting as though missing July 4th automatically destroys the entire effort. That simply isn't true. The legislative process doesn't vanish because a symbolic deadline passes. In reality, some of the biggest disagreements involve specific provisions within the bill itself. One of the largest sticking points revolves around ethics language and government oversight concerns. Certain lawmakers want stronger protections against conflicts of interest. Others believe some of those provisions go too far. These disagreements have slowed negotiations. But notice what lawmakers are arguing about. They're debating details. They're debating wording. They're debating implementation. They're not debating whether crypto deserves a regulatory framework. That battle has largely already been won. The discussion has evolved beyond whether clarity should exist. The discussion is now about what that clarity should look like. And that's actually a sign of progress. Now let's talk about the single most important fact that almost nobody emphasizes. Even if the legislation passed tomorrow, even if lawmakers somehow completed every step, even if the president signed the bill before fireworks exploded across the sky on July 4th, the actual rules still wouldn't exist. That's right. The thing many investors expect to happen immediately wouldn't happen immediately at all. Federal agencies would still need to draft regulations. Public comment periods would still need to occur. Revisions would still need to be made. Implementation procedures would still need to be finalized, and all of that takes time, a lot of time. Most realistic estimates suggest the full regulatory framework wouldn't become operational until sometime around 2027. Think about how important that is. If the practical effects aren't expected until 2027 anyway, why are investors acting as if July 4th is the final chapter? It's not. At most, it's an important milestone. The race doesn't end there. The race actually begins there. And once you understand that, much of the panic starts disappearing. Now let's bring this back to XRP specifically, because XRP's relationship with regulation is unlike almost any other major crypto asset. For years, XRP operated under a cloud of uncertainty. Questions about classification, questions about oversight, questions about how regulators viewed the asset. Those questions created hesitation among institutions, and institutions hate uncertainty. Banks hate uncertainty. Financial companies hate uncertainty. They don't move billions of dollars based on hype. They move when legal frameworks become clear. That's why regulatory clarity matters so much for XRP. Not because it guarantees a specific price. Not because it creates instant wealth, but because it removes barriers that have existed for years. It gives institutions confidence. It creates a clearer path forward. And it allows long-term adoption to grow on a stronger foundation. What's fascinating is that even critics of the legislation sometimes acknowledge this reality. Some have raised concerns about implementation challenges. Others have questioned whether regulatory agencies have enough resources. But even many skeptics admit that established networks like XRP are positioned far better than smaller projects when regulatory clarity eventually arrives. That matters, because it suggests XRP isn't standing on shaky ground waiting for one political event to save it. Instead, XRP appears to be one of the assets most capable of benefiting from a mature regulatory environment whenever it fully arrives. And that's exactly why long-term investors should stay focused on the bigger picture. Let's be honest. Throughout recent years, XRP holders have watched major developments occur without immediate explosive price reactions. Legal victories happened, partnerships expanded, regulatory progress improved, institutional conversations advanced. Yet price action often remained quieter than many expected. Some investors became frustrated, but perhaps that quiet reaction reveals something important. Maybe XRP's story was never supposed to be built on one headline. Maybe it was never supposed to depend on one date. Maybe the real story has always been about building foundations. Strong foundations don't create instant fireworks. They create long-term stability. And long-term stability is exactly what institutions want before committing significant capital. So as we approach July 4th, remember this. The headlines want urgency. Social media wants fear. The algorithm rewards panic. But facts tell a different story. The direction of crypto regulation has moved further than many thought possible just a few years ago. The conversation continues advancing. Lawmakers continue negotiating. Support continues existing on both sides of the discussion. And regardless of whether the final vote happens before July 4th or sometime afterward, the broader trend remains remarkably clear. Regulatory clarity is moving closer, not farther away. And for XRP holders, that's the development that truly matters. So don't let a countdown clock convince you that everything depends on one day. Don't let fear override facts. And don't let noise distract you from the bigger picture. The future of XRP won't be determined by a single deadline. It will be determined by years of adoption, utility, institutional participation, and regulatory progress. And right now, that foundation continues getting stronger. One step at a time, one development at a time, one breakthrough at a time. This is XRP Matrix. If you enjoyed today's analysis, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay connected because the next few weeks could be some of the most important weeks XRP investors have seen in years. Stay patient, stay informed, stay positive. And I'll see you in the next one.